This is a production of Cornell University.
And it's hard enough to follow Alan Armitage, but now I have to follow that intro. Apologies, everybody. This was a cool thing that showed up on the web. All right, they told me I was supposed to talk about edible diseases. Well, this is edible flowers, for starters. Those are cupcakes, okay? And I'm going to enjoy taking you through some of the stories about edibles, because that's what I'm supposed to talk about. And we'll see if all these little wires start working. Oh, cool, okay. Because Betsy and Neil, who were putting the program together, asked me to talk about edibles, and I work on diseases. So I'm going to talk to you about edible diseases, at least to the beginning here for a little while. So here you have the first edible disease. Some of you may have eaten this one. This is something we used to call the sulfur shelf, and it's bright orange. So my husband Robert will not touch it because he says food should not be that orange, but it is quite delicious, and it's a very weak parasite of trees, more of a saprophyte, but it can cause a weak rot of the tree, and you'll get sort of a brown heart rot in a tree. So we can have revenge on this particular disease by eating it. So it's an edible disease, all right? Here's another one. If you love your turf, you'll think of this as fairy ring. And that's a disease, right? You know, a fairy ring. You might think of those as places toads sit, but it's better to think about fairies dancing. And however, if you get close enough, you can realize that's also an edible disease because you have chanterelles there. Perfectly edible, perfectly wonderful. And then finally, one that all the people who watch trees perish in their landscapes get to know, Armillaria mellia, which causes armillaria root rot or the shoestring root rot, has an alter ego. It's known as the honey fungus because it creates a mushroom when it fruits up from the sick roots, and we can eat that mushroom. It's a very delicious mushroom with a sweetish kind of flavor to it. So here again, you've got a plant disease that is truly inedible. But just one last one, because it's still before lunch. I think you can handle this. We don't always think of corn as an ornamental, but there is an ornamental popcorn now. And for many years, we've had a edible disease of the corn plant. How many of you have ever seen corn smut? It's sort of a very interesting thing that will take the kernels of the corn and turn them into these big swollen white balls. And those balls are later on filled with white smut spores, because this is a smut fungus. And the amazing thing is that the Mexicans in particular really value this as an extremely valuable foodstuff. And when I got to travel down to Mexico years ago, we were able to get tacos that had huitlacoche in there. And it was very exciting, tasted like spinach. A lot of hype for something that tasted like spinach. But it's one of the diseases we can have revenge on by consuming them. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to too many of our ornamental plants, and diseases are just a pain. But I wanted to know that there is a possibility for a little revenge on the diseases that are ornamental. These are the crops that I find growers getting most aware of now. Alan was absolutely right. When people say vegetables, they mean tomatoes. And I think the greenhouse growers who used to grow flowers all understand that. They're now growing flowers plus tomatoes if they're not touching anything else. And the other thing they figured out quite a while ago was that that also included herbs. So you'll see on my list basil and rosemary, because they are grown so widely by the folks who used to think in terms of geraniums and poinsettias, and also tomatoes, peppers, kale, and the cucumber and squash group, the cucurbits. So these are the topics I'll touch on today, and when we're doing our little disease walkabout this afternoon, I can talk about some of the other horrible, dreadful diseases like the ones that are attacking begonias and attacking impatiens and what have you. When it comes to the diseases of edible crops, below ground, it's pretty much all the same as what you know. The same fungi, things like Pythium and Rhizoctonia and Phytophthora, are going to be able to go after the roots of your edibles just like they can go after the roots of your flower crops. The unfortunate thing is you have a lot fewer things you can do about them. You can't whip out the ban rot to treat your edible plants. So you need to be an even better grower when you're producing the vegetables, because you need to have extremely good sanitation so that you can pull these crops through without using things illegally and unsafely on the edible crops. Here's another example, Phytophthora on lavender, a very common disease problem because lavenders want to be in a nice Mediterranean climate, and you put them in the greenhouse and water them along with everything else, they get too wet. So yes, one problem is the sanitation, because the Phytophthora can be there and pounce on them, but the more wetness you have, the more horrendous an epidemic you're going to have in the greenhouse. So let's start out with basil. I think this is the one that drives the most people the craziest. Here's a long list of the things that can go wrong with basil. We'll focus mostly on the downy mildew because that's certainly the ultimate problem on that. But you have an assortment of difficulties for that crop potentially. You can have viruses like the INSV and the TSWV up at the top. You can have various fungal problems like anthracnoses or Cercospora leaf spot. You can even have a systemic disease, a Fusarium wilt disease, root rot problems, and then in other parts of the world they even have rusts and powdery mildews. So if we start importing basil from other places, we may get those diseases on top of the ones that you have listed here. Upper left there, you'll see some mottling on the foliage. That's the look of TSWV or INSV, the two viruses carried by thrips that can affect basil. I see this a lot because the basil tends to be grown right there along with the cutting-produced flowers. And your cutting-produced flowers are one of the ways you're going to get TSWV or INSV going in the greenhouse. Thrips can move it from one plant to the next. Basil is one of the susceptible plants, so that's one of the many things you need to protect your basil against. And then at the right is an image that I took up here in Ithaca when I was visiting. Neil and I were doing some experiments with basil, and we got the Fusarium wilt. We weren't expecting it, but unfortunately that particular disease is spread by seed. So again, gee, sometimes I think these grafting ideas are good because if we can get away from everyone working with seed that has sort of unknown cleanliness, we might be able to get away from the possibility of a Fusarium wilt. Obviously, it can kill the plant. Once in a rare while, we'll see an anthracnose or a Cercospora leaf spot like you see here. And this is the big one. All right, in this lighting, it's not too obvious, but there's a little yellowing on that basil. And when you turn the leaf over, you see a little dirt on the underside. It looks a little furry. And over the telephone, people have told me that looks like botrytis, but they'll mention that the leaf is still green. So that's the look of downy mildew starting out on the underside of your basil leaves. We found last year when we did some experiments with a slow-release fertilizer combined with a fungicide that the more you fertilize the plant, the more impressive you can make the downy mildew look. So you can get large yellow window panes when the downy mildew is going after basil under a high fertilized situation. And this is more the field look. Okay, a farmer initially back when this was not a well-known disease would look at this and think he needed to add more nitrogen, but it's certainly changed now to where people are really watching all the time for downy mildew to come in. This is a contrast here between the downy mildew on the basil and the downy mildew on coleus. Initially we thought they might be the same organism, but it turns out they really aren't the same. They look the same under the microscope when they make their spores. The spores are pretty much the same. But this is a lesson in nitpicking here, just for those of you who think people at universities are a little geeky and worry about details. The way we can tell them apart is because one of them is sort of a 1.24 length to breadth ratio versus a 1.29 length to breadth ratio. And they call this broadly ellipsoidal versus egg shape. Now, is that picayune or what? So they're really close in size, but you can measure the difference if you have a lot of time. And then even better yet, now we have DNA analysis where we can really compare one organism to the other. And there are a lot of base pairs different in those two organisms. So you end up with the coleus not really being named yet, and the disease on the basil is Paranospora balbarii. So basically, this is important to you as a garden center or whatever because you don't have to worry about the downy mildew on your coleus moving into your basil. And that's important because we do have a coleus problem with a very similar downy mildew. Getting back to the basil, this story is not terribly long because we haven't had this disease in the United States or in North America until 2007. So it is new to us. That's why basil used to grow so well and now it doesn't. It's a new disease. It's one of these things that we run into because we have global distribution of plants now. And it's been quite a problem since it showed up in Florida in 2007. It was probably only about a year after we started having trouble with the coleus. You get that furry growth of the spores on the underside of the leaf, and this is what it looks like under the microscope. It makes sort of a little tree, and you get these little footballs hanging from the ends of the branches that you can only see with the microscope. The curious thing about this disease is that it actually was known first in Africa. It was seen in Uganda in 1933, and then people were not paying a whole lot of attention to it. but there was an outbreak in 1994 where it started moving into Switzerland and then started moving around Europe. And it wasn't too long after that that we saw it in Florida. So now it's a worldwide problem. All the little yellow spots show you places where this disease has appeared now. Pretty much all the places where anyone would ever grow basil. One curious slant is that it shows up in microgreens also. Talk about a way to devastate a crop. There's a lot of yellow modeling that shows when you have better lighting on the image here at the left, and you can see the dirtiness on the underside of the cotyledons of those little basil seedlings. If you were a microgreen producer, you just have to hang it up when you see this. You're not going to get your crop through. It's impossible. And then you can't really get the other crops through that might be just behind it. You have to really clear everything out and start over again once the spores have died down. Really a devastating problem, and it's quite obvious in this situation that you have a seed-borne problem. Okay? It definitely can get started from the seed. So no matter how early your plant is started, you might have a problem with it. And then a few years ago, we had a company that got interested in doing grafted basil, but without proper respect for the downy mildew. And it became a problem in some of the production. These were great plants. How much did you sell these for, Mark? You didn't have those? You're smart. I mean, they were selling for, somewhere between $25 and $50 a piece. This was in Greenwich, Connecticut. I know it was $25 or so. A lot to sell a basil plant for, mind you, but they did also, in some cases, come with some downy mildew, so those plants were complete losses. So you paid a lot for your initial grafted plant, and then you could not sell it later on. So as we get into these special new crops, we really ought to look for their Achilles heels and plan for them. Meg McGrath, who works in vegetable plant pathology with me down at the Long Island Horticultural Research and Extension Center, had put together some interesting data collection on the subject of basil downy mildew by using the web to get people to tell her what was happening where. And so she's got some interesting stats on it. We've known about the disease in New York and Florida for, now it would be more like 10 years because the slide's a few years old, but you can see New York's always at the epicenter of everything. And then here's some more. Look up here, 74 reports from New York up till 2014. That's because we were going around giving talks about it and everybody was saying, oh yeah, we've got it. It's not really worse in New York, but don't for one moment think that we don't have to deal with it. It's not a southern person's disease. It's a disease of the entire industry. And it's certainly a disease of the greenhouse industry as well as the outdoor industry. So you as greenhouse industry people want to make sure you're not sharing that disease with farmers in your vicinity any earlier than they're going to have to cope with it for other reasons. There also is a real global aspect to this. It's showing up in places, Argentina is having to fight basil downy mildew now. The important effort on this is the same one that we're going to see with other diseases. We've looked into the types of basil and how susceptible they are, and there are now at least 2 major breeding programs, one at Rutgers and one at the University of Florida, where they're looking to get us something that's not as susceptible as the standard Ocimum basilicum, or however that should be pronounced, because your basic Genovese basil is highly susceptible to downy mildew. So they noticed that if you had the Americanum species, that you would have a much less highly susceptible plant. So there are efforts to breed those genetics into the plant that we're selling that will ultimately become pesto or a caprese salad or what have you. And there has been some success along those lines, but we're not quite there yet. At this point, some of you have probably grown the Eleonora, which is a sweet basil that has a little bit of resistance in it. It's not that it won't get the disease, but it'll get it a little slower. So that's on the market at the moment, probably one of the better options. There is a reason why we're finding the seed transmission, and that's because the downy mildew makes a special kind of spore that allows it to reside within the seed, make it through that winter period, and we know it's there. We could treat the seed to get rid of the problem, except for the fact that basil seeds are really goopy when you get them in hot water. So there's only one company in Europe at this point that is treating seed to get rid of the downy mildew, and that they're using a steam treatment method that somehow avoids the gloppiness. So if you can get some of that European heat-treated material out of Germany, then you'll be better off. And gloppy is not a botanical term, but it works great. Who didn't understand that term? We'll define it for you. And the amount of basil that gets basil seed that has the problem is pretty high. And these are European figures here. When they did one survey, they found that it was virtually in everything, and that when you planted it out, a pretty high percentage of those seed lots were going to give them disease. So if you've been feeling like it's just you and there's something really torturing you, it's not. There's seed contamination, and it's very hard to avoid it. Yes?
How are seeds getting contaminated?
When the plant is contaminated, when that plant is being grown as a seed parent, there is infection of the entire plant systemically. It's a systemic disease, so it can come from inside. The plant survives long enough to produce seed, right? It would have to be a later infection for just that reason, yeah. And then it gets inside and stays inside as oospores. Yeah, it's too bad, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, there's one really interesting little thing which I'm hoping this industry can be clever enough to capitalize on. Some of the research in Israel has shown that light really impedes the spore production of the Basil Downy Mildew. It doesn't stop infection. I wish it stopped infection. That would be even better. But if you can keep the leaves directly in contact with light, you can stop spore production. That really stops your epidemic, or at least slows it down a great deal. So they've done things. They produce their basil in fields, and in the night they're just stringing lights over them and providing light, and they're getting something like 18 days of protection on a plant. The thicker the canopy gets, the more you have parts of the plant that aren't directly exposed to the light, so your effectiveness goes down. But if you're growing something like microgreens, you could really make use of light. And this will illustrate the idea for you. Those blue things on the left are test tube caps, and after these plants were sprayed with sporangia of downy mildew, the test tube caps were placed on and then given a little time, all right? And the only places where you got spore production 3 days later were over at the right where you see the darkness, the places where the test tubes kept the light off. Okay, really nifty. And you know, you can use this to your betterment. Whether you can make it go away completely that way, I would doubt, but you could probably make things better by supplying light during your basil production. So these are the kind of things you want to think about if you're trying to get basil through without downy mildew. If you can buy clean seed that has been treated with steam, try to go with your less susceptible varieties, and this will be getting better all the time. I think in 4 years or so we'll have plants we can buy that won't get this disease anymore. Check if you're bringing in transplants, look them over really hard. If you see any yellowing on the leaves, put them in a plastic bag with a wet paper towel overnight and see if they're furry underneath the next morning. You can look for the downy mildew. Do a lot of scouting. And you can apply treatments, and you do need to apply treatments. The phosphorus acids, Rebus and Ranman are your options for chemical control in the greenhouse. Keep your humidity down, play with the light, experimentally see what you can do with that. And if you have a problem, just get rid of everything and then start over again. That's really all you can do. We're also suggesting that you try to grow basil earlier in the season, because the further you get into summer, the more likely you are to run into some sort of inoculum coming in from outside the greenhouse getting into your production. So earlier production is safer than later production, but even early production you might get in trouble because of seed transmission. Not all seeds contaminated, but some is. Okay, I mentioned these. Here are your products that are phosphorus acids on the top row. Just some examples of ones that are labeled for use on basil, things like K-Phyte or Phosphite or Rampart. They're in a group that's called the FRAC group 33 that have phosphorus acid as their active ingredient. And Rebus and Ranman are the things people would be using on outdoor crops, but they have labels that do not prohibit use in greenhouses. So that's an option for you too. It's perfectly okay to use that group 33 over and over again if you want to. It's not prone to resistance development, and most growers are doing that, but it's only going to last for about a week. Okay, next plant, rosemary. It's a plant without a lot of problems, but it has a few, and my job is to tell you what they are. Primarily, you're going to have to battle powdery mildew on rosemary, and this last year was a bad year for powdery mildew on rosemary. It was in the trade for whatever reason. So many of you discovered it for the first time and were wondering why your plants look white when they were supposed to look green. They're supposed to have a little bit of a waxy bloom, but not that much waxy bloom. You get this kind of a look, okay? It looks like it's been dusted. Ideally, you should be scouting for this, and the minute you see any of it, really go right in there and start a program where you're working with something that will stop powdery mildew, because once it begins in the greenhouse, you have high enough humidity that it's going to keep happening in the greenhouse all season long. This is a similar looking plant, but it looks worse. This particular case is downy mildew. And I've only seen this once, but because we're having such a bad time with downy mildews on so many other plants, I just want to warn you about it. So if you see something that is making the plants look really unhappy, but you don't see the powdery mildew on, keep this in mind as one possible explanation. Again, just throw it away if you see it. It's hopefully not going to be a big deal. For powdery mildew maintenance, which is a more standard thing, this experiment might give you a few ideas. We work with ultrafine oil. Now you would probably be using Suff Oil X. And we work with millstop and cease. And we try them alone. And you can see that the millstop and the oil work most powerfully to reduce the powdery mildew. We also try it alternations, which is much more what you would be likely to do in the greenhouse. And by using 3 of those ingredients together or alternating 2 of them, it worked really easily. So probably millstop with one of the others would be your best program to use to keep your powdery mildew managed on rosemary in the greenhouse. Tomato diseases, okay? This is the one vegetable. And this is the main one I really want to speak to you about because homeowners all want this, but not all of you are used to growing vegetables. You started out in the flower industry in many cases, so you don't know the standard things that any tomato grower would know. And you need to know these things. The disease there that's at the end of the list, Phytophthora infestans, is a scary disease. It brought us all the Irish over from Ireland because they were starving to death because of the effects of that disease on the potato crop. And then somewhere along the lines, the organism learned to switch over and also attack tomatoes. So now we have something that's a really serious disease that we might end up harboring in our greenhouse industry. And we don't want to be doing that. And then there are a few other things there that are everyday for a farmer that you might not know about. One of the ones you do know about is this. A couple of years ago, just season before this, we had a real scare about TMV, tobacco mosaic virus, on petunias in the greenhouse. And if you carried a crop all the way through, you might see symptoms like these where you get a variegation or mottling in the flowers of the plant. Early season, many growers also saw strap-like leaves or stunting or dead leaves because of the effects of TMV on petunia. That comes from an error up at the source of your cuttings. And the company that had that problem bent over backwards to clean it all up and have a good year this year, and it worked. So I'm glad to see that extra sanitation will defend us against this problem. But many people did learn that it was scary because they learned that petunias could be a source of trouble for tomatoes in particular. And it also has a huge host range. The biggest danger would be heirloom tomatoes because they don't have any natural resistance built into them. So if you're growing petunias, particularly if you're bringing them in as cuttings from offshore, really try to keep your tomatoes away from them. That's one of the smartest things you can do. This is the kind of thing you can do to a tomato fruit. It's not pretty. You can do a lot of other ugly things you might not even get to fruit. We learned that non-fat dried milk is one of our most useful control materials when you're dealing with TMV in the greenhouse. So if you do find that you have it, respond with an excellent sanitation disposal and a lot of use of dry milk solution. Okay, bacterial leaf spots. One of the many things that we have to worry about on tomatoes. We've seen this, 7 or 8 times this year down on Long Island. It's a pretty common disease on tomatoes. You probably all have it at home. Not easy to tell which one is which, but there are 3 bacterial leaf problems that can occur in tomatoes. Bacterial spots, the most common, which is a Xanthomonas bacterium, but there's also bacterial canker and bacterial speck. And there's a fungal leaf spot that you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference from, which is the one here at the lower right. That's a Septoria leaf spot. That's also pretty common on tomato. To work against that, the farmers have learned to use treated seed. I don't know that you folks are always getting treated seed, but maybe you want to look into that because hot water treatment will eliminate some of these problems. You can use copper and agromycin type fungicides on tomato and pepper in the greenhouse, but not necessarily on any of your other crops because they're labeled for specific vegetables. You want to reduce your leaf wetness and splashing because that can move bacteria from place to place. And really inspect your plants and throw away problems while they're still small. You may not want to do a lot of treatment, but just an occasional copper maintenance spray may help you stay out of a big problem with this kind of leaf spotting. Another spotter on tomato is tomato spotted wilt virus. You heard a lot about this virus as ornamental producers before you ever grew a tomato, but there's a reason why it's called tomato spotted wilt. It can make spots on tomato, all right? And it looks a little different each time, just as it looks different on each of your flower crops. It can look different on each tomato cultivar that you might grow. And it can be ugly, so it's another one of the things you don't want to get into your vegetable crops. This virus isn't on seed, so if you can keep your cutting grown crops and your thrips away from tomatoes that you're producing from seed, that'll do a great deal of good to keeping TSWV away from them. You get fruit symptoms as well as spots when you have TSWV in tomatoes. And one of the things that helps you identify it are these blackish streaks that are down the middle of the leaf there. That's quite typical of TSWV on a tomato. And then really ugly things can happen to the tomatoes. Your customers won't like TSWV on their tomatoes. Keeping the flowers and the vegetables apart would be great for this. It's not possible for some of you, but it's a goal. All right, I think it will help our future production because we don't like being in a situation where we have, for example, a material that you can spray on one plant, but it's illegal to spray on the one beside it. It's not a good situation to be in. So I think keeping things separate will really help us in the future. And definitely watching them and knowing what the symptoms are so that you can pick up on them just as they're starting up. And then finally, the late blight. Late blight will cause large dead areas in the leaves, and it can look a lot like botrytis. We worked with a grower a couple years ago who was treating for botrytis because he thought he had botrytis in his tomatoes because he was a flower grower. He knew botrytis, but he didn't know about late blight, which causes large lesions with maybe a pale rim around them. And then it can also cause stem lesions. Hopefully you can make out that these are a little bit frosty, and that's because you get a lot of the sporangia produced on the surface. It's almost like a downy mildew. The Phytophthora infestans that causes this late blight disease is truly genetically very similar to a downy mildew, and it's airborne. So it can move great distances, and it's really a pernicious threat. This is the kind of thing it does to a tomato, all right? Not a good thing, all right? And it can do this to a tomato, also not a good thing. We do know it can go to petunias. It's very rare that it goes to petunias, but this is one of Margot Bechtel's slides, who got her PhD here at Cornell a number of years ago. She caused this particular infection, but this is a picture from a box that was shipped into me sometime that incubated en route and got real fuzzy on the way. You really can occasionally have that disease in petunias, so watch for that. Let me know if you see anything remotely like it. This is a picture from the botrytis-like late blight infection that occurred a couple of years ago. We still have no idea what the source was, and we're thinking it might have been some solanaceous ornamental out of Central America that was growing in the same greenhouse. We have no idea. The strain was tested here at Cornell, and we know it's not the standard strains. This is a listing that you don't need to pay a whole lot of attention to, other than to see that the strain called US 23 is sensitive to mefenoxam, which is in Subdue Max, and that one affects potato and tomato, and it's the dominant one that we've been seeing in New York for the past several years. Good in some ways, bad in others. And this is one of Meg's maps that gives you a sense, if you follow the dates, of how the late blight disease would ordinarily start down in Florida and move its way up the coast and get to us late, which is why it's called late blight. But guess what? Our greenhouse industry ships plants all over creation. So in 2009, there was enough shipping of contaminated tomatoes from the south that it got all over the Northeast, and it was a really early epidemic problem for all the farmers in the Northeast. So we don't want to be part of that. We need to inspect our crops and make sure we're not moving late blight around. This repeats everything I just said, I think. Definitely watch for this one. It's not going to be common, but it's bad if you get it. And I wanted to give you some hope here. There's information now on some cultivars that are resistant to late blight. And as an industry, particularly if you're a garden center, you can really help people by offering and promoting the late blight resistant cultivars. So here we're going to have the same control at the right-hand side for each of these images. Mountain Fresh Plus obviously is susceptible to the disease. It's blighted, right? Over at the left you see Mountain Merit, which looks pretty good. And up at the top it's got a little notation there. It tells you it has 2 different genes for resistance. But if we go to Iron Lady, nice name, huh? Looks good. And Mountain Fresh Plus, of course, looks really dead. And here you have Mountain Magic, which has probably gotten the most promotion. Has anybody sold Mountain Magic? Ah, good. It's good to see the hands. All right. Good idea. And here we got Jasper. Jasper's a cherry tomato. And really very, very good resistance. That's what the tomatoes look like at the upper right. That's Meg's husband, and Sandy Menashe, our vegetable agent, down at the right. Jasper's a really high-performing cherry tomato, resistant to the late blight. And this information's all on the web. Meg has an excellent website that you can get to that's a Vegetable MD site that's at Cornell. The resistance is coming from a wild relative of the tomato, this Solanum pimpinellifolium is where those genes are coming from, and thank goodness for them, because that will, with time, breed us out of this problem and make everything wonderful again. I have an app too. Meg and I worked together on one with the Plant Pathology Society that's available. It's, the notes are in your handout sheet. If you look under either Plant Health or Tomato MD with a space between Tomato and MD, it's not as pretty as Alan's app, I'm sorry. It has all sick plants in it. I don't think there's a single healthy plant in the entire app. But if you want to have one for reference when you're talking to gardeners at your garden center or you have tomatoes at home, it has 350 or so pictures of sick tomatoes in it. That's pretty cool, right? Yes?
I wondered whether solanation weeds would harbor the late blight.
Yes, that's a very good question. It's very true, unfortunately. Certain ones that are solanum, okay, will definitely harbor late blight. The biggest harborer is, however, potato, because you'll get potato volunteers, you know, the next year. It doesn't overwinter in tomato per se, but potato is a very bad carryover. So if you alternate between potato and tomato in your fields, and you have potatoes coming up among the tomatoes, the disease will come right along with it. And yeah, weed control doesn't hurt either, absolutely. Okay, just a couple things on pepper. The ornamental pepper is prone to bacterial leaf spots, and also the non-ornamental pepper is prone to bacterial leaf spots. So again, copper might be useful to you there. We've also seen INSV on peppers, and all sorts of interesting different spots. Pale spots, brown spots. The INSV really moves in on those. And then even a zigzag line, you might see that symptom. This could only be caused by a virus. There's nothing else that can give you that kind of a pattern in a plant. And one other whole disease curiosity that you might be aware of and might not, the powdery mildew we're used to seeing on verbenas also goes to cucurbits. So if you're growing verbenas as flowers, and also, hey, new one this year, we started having a lot of trouble with calibrachoas with powdery mildew. That's also the same one. So you can have movement from the cucurbit back and forth to the verbena. And it's good to know those are good things to keep apart and be aware of that. If you've seen pumpkins looking white in the fall, that's from powdery mildew. It's very damaging to the fruits and tends to create sun scorch when they've got the powdery mildew. But those spores can grow and blow into the greenhouse if you're thinking of keeping verbena over, and then you can keep the powdery mildew over on the verbena. And I wouldn't say this except I've seen people do it. So they'll keep verbena in the back, and then they wonder why their zucchini are looking funny the next spring. Well, this is why. They managed to keep the inoculum over. And we will see the same disease on petunias, particularly in the field at the end of the year. There is a lot of variation from one verbena to the next, and that problem has gone way down. The industry really got rid of the cultivars that were highly susceptible. So I don't think it's a common problem anymore, but maybe the calibrachoa problem is on the way up. So watch them and keep the powdery mildew under control, because you don't want to cause the farmers in your area to have extra trouble with early epidemics because you're growing that same disease on your flower crops. Bacterial things are bothering our kale and ornamental cabbage growers now. And again, the farmers know this disease. You might not if you're coming in from the ornamental side of things. Here's an ornamental kale with yellow wedges in the leaves, starting on the lower leaves and climbing up the plant. The disease is called black rot, and it's a xanthomonas, not the same one that goes to geraniums. It's just a cousin. And it's seed-borne. Aha, another problem. And as the kale got more popular the past few years, I think it lowered the seed quality because everybody was scrambling to get enough seed. So particularly the red borer cultivar of kale has been a real problem for our growers in recent years. It is a systemic disease, so you can see in a cross-section of the stem little black areas where the vascular system is infected. And you can put it under the microscope, and over at the right, maybe you can envision there's a pulsing out of lots of little bacterial cells in water from a cut vein. Really an easily spread disease, so it's good for you to be aware of it so that you will be able to recognize it and rogue out the plants that have that problem and go on to grow the rest with the help of some copper sprays. These things are all handleable if you're not ignorant of them. So just being aware of what the problems are that can affect your edible crops that you're growing in the greenhouse will help you a great deal. And hopefully everything can just be hunky-dory in your production. I don't want to take any questions just because of our time situation, because I want you to have a break. But thanks for your attention, and you'll all have a chance to ask me questions this afternoon when we're going around. Thanks.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.